Marxists either aren't aware of, or if they are, they lie about it for the furthering of their political aims, which is that labor is almost by definition the furthest from the money printer. They will never own a house, become an entrepreneur. They are trapped in only ever selling their labor. What I'm about to say, I think, is more or less exhaustive. And this is where I completely disagree with a Marxist, right? I don't think you can really talk about the conditions of labor without recognizing what are the financial conditions that are either incentivizing or disincentivizing the entrepreneurship that is necessary to create these jobs. This actually affects everything. It doesn't just affect housing.
For the sake of this discussion, we can say magically we're instantly on a Bitcoin standard. Explain to me how you would imagine the unwinding of what we've been through since 1971.
Basically what happens is Archie.
Why do you think it's fiat that diminishes the ability of a worker to save and not the system itself?
What do you mean by the system itself? What distinguishes the two?
Take a more classic approach to labor versus capital. And I think well and truly, at least in Western societies in the last 40 years, capital has just been running rings around labor. And the dynamic at the bargaining table is well and truly tilted in favor of capital and a very small cohort of high-end workers.
This is maybe, I guess I should apologize if your audience isn't sufficiently steeped in Bitcoin dogma that to me this is the same thing. Like this is
why is it the same thing? I don't see it as the same thing.
As in when I asked you to clarify what do you mean by fiat versus the system, like to me fiat is the system. And I appreciate this is very kind of this is Bitcoin dogma, so people may not agree with this. So this dichotomy of where the power lies between labor and capital, even that is interesting because I think a lot of people will reflexively oppose that framing as essentially Marxist. I wouldn't, for what it's worth. I think it's just accurate, but I think there's some missing pieces that obviously Marxists would, like actual Marxists, either aren't aware of, or if they are, they lie about it for the furthering of their political aims, which is that the main reason that currently the power is so tilted towards capital is because fiat is so out of control. Labor is almost by definition the furthest from the money printer. Capital is almost by definition the closest to it. I mean, in particular, and we don't need to go into too much detail on this if you don't want to, but the precise mechanism of money creation within fiat is effectively giving capital a zero cost of capital and labor kind of an infinite cost. It depends exactly how you define it, but the most expensive costs such that they are effectively priced out, right? There is no reason to expect that this power dynamic would exist really at all, but certainly to anywhere near this degree without the mechanism of fiat. And so that's what I mean when I say, like, I genuinely, to me, the system is fiat. I just use them interchangeably. I apologize if that's unhelpful.
No, that's fine.
This is kind of my shtick, is just whining about fiat all day long.
I think
that's why you have me on.
I think it makes for a really good conversation to flesh out, I guess, some of the nuances in that. Because when I alluded before to a small cohort of workers who are labor, actually doing really quite well under the fiat system. So I would suggest that while fiat printing is a huge component of what we're discussing, that diminished negotiating power is probably a larger component of that.
Yeah, but where do you think that comes from, though? I mean, I can give my argument and tell me if you think I'm missing anything. But this is kind of the key for me, that what I'm about to say, I think, is more or less exhaustive. And this is where I completely disagree with, I guess, again, a Marxist, right? It was like a three-way debate here with an actual Marxist, and the starting point was we agree on the contemporary skew in political power towards capital and away from labor. Like, on the one hand, why, and on the other, then what? I think we disagree on almost all of that. For me, where this even comes from, and I don't see the point in really identifying anything else, is, I guess, two things. One I mentioned already, which is the money creation mechanism whereby capital has zero cost of capital. Maybe more importantly, certainly it's downstream of this, and I think the social consequences are much, much worse. is that even aside from this somewhat abstract concept of cost of capital, the inevitable consequence of the extremity of inflation and the inability to save, basically, is more what I mean rather than inflation per se, is the monetization of other asset classes. And I think the chain of events that leads us to where we are now is both, like, it's unavoidable, it's undeniable, and it's also more or less exhaustive in terms of describing the situation labor is in, which is that in particular, real estate is monetized. Obviously, lots of other things are monetized too, but the reason I'm focusing on real estate is whereas the average worker doesn't really care about like where the S&P is, it doesn't really affect them.
Or fine wine and arts and watches. Or
they may have very indirect exposure via their pension funds, say, but it doesn't really affect their day-to-day decision making. It completely prices them out of ever owning a home in a lot of cases. Like this is a meme well beyond Bitcoin. This is just like nobody can afford a home, which is really tragic for a couple of reasons. So one being that this is actually the more practical explanation of why they can't save rather than just these like abstractions of inflation and money printing and whatever else. It's that they're in a, quote unquote fiat job. They're fiat mining, but they need to put disproportionate amount of their income to covering rent because they have no choice, and the rent is inflated because it's satisfying the monetary premium of real estate rather than being priced on its utility, and so they have no disposable income. And this is basically what it means to be as far as possible from the money printer. They only pay for the inflated prices. They never benefit from them themselves, and that then becomes reflexive though, because by having no leftover savings, like by being unable to save, basically, they can't ever accumulate any capital either. So not only are all their expenses going towards housing, they will also never own a house, right? Never mind, something that you'd more classically describe as capital. They'll never be in a position to become an entrepreneur and, potentially actually benefit from creating wealth in a more kind of directly productive way rather than selling their labor. And so they're by this mechanism, they are trapped in only ever selling their labor and only ever buying things that they need and that are monetized. And that, I think, is, again, I've said this a couple of times, but just to really emphasize it, I think that's an exhaustive explanation of the phenomenon that you set up as a discussion point. I don't think you need anything else. I think if you understand fiat, you understand this problem.
Perhaps you can call it cherry picking, but a starting point will be what the fuck happened in 1971, right? Let's just say, fiat printing went into overdrive since then.
Mm-hmm.
We also had significant inflation during the period from in the 1970s, early to mid 80s, before we hit upon perhaps the mid-90s, before we saw the great moderation as a result of China's rise, industrialization that had a deflationary effect on the world economy. In the 70s and 80s, workers were able to save, despite what the fuck happened in 1971. Yep. But something happened from the 2000s onwards that stopped them from being able to save. What do you think that was?
Honestly, don't know. I don't have a particular theory on this. Do you have a theory on it?
I suspect that reduced bargaining power.
Mm-hmm.
Two things we saw in deindustrialization. Let's just talk in an American context because it's easy for everyone to understand. Deindustrialization, reduced demand for labor, and diminished labor membership as well.
Mm-hmm.
Probably a combination of those two. A third thing, I'd probably say that liberalization of labor laws as well. People became a lot more flexible, part-time casual work as well, made more people price takers, further undermining their ability to bargain in the workplace. And so you're being crushed at the top end, and then the inability to save. Let's just say that there was a progressive diminishing ability to save, meant that fewer and fewer people were able to buy a house. So then they became price takers in the rental market as well.
Right.
And so that's, I think, those two, the top line and your biggest line expense, are pretty much crushing everybody.
I would push back on this a little bit. Not to disagree with the facts in large part because I don't consider myself remotely an expert on, I mean, I would class this as like some element at least of geopolitics, let's say, and kind of longer term macroeconomic, which I'm not saying sarcastically, I mean actual macroeconomic trends. I am not an expert in that. I'm also frankly not all that interested in it because it's the, as I'm sure is coming across, it's the theory behind, I guess the what would you call it? The mechanics of the financial system that interests me more, and I think determines a lot of what you're talking about. Not exclusively, but it's I think you can't afford to leave it out. So the reason I push back a little bit is that I think that the way you described what you just described is kind of unfortunately Keynesian or has a Keynesian lean.
Which aspects
in
of it?
In the sense of you describing everything in terms of aggregates that the individuals involved can't really affect or respond to. So again, I'm not saying that these facts are wrong. I'm saying that I dislike the interpretation, and I'll offer what I think is better. You might disagree, but this is what I think is a better interpretation. That the idea of I get a little to be clear, not with you, because this is very much kind of emanating from just like Fiat Keynesian, economists and academia and the media and whatever else. The idea that labor, first of all, exists as a block and sort of does things collectively, and that there is a price for it. I get why you would think that way, but I think it stems from only observing and not understanding. And so why I think that's relevant is that the demand for labor as opposed to its supply always originates with entrepreneurship and ultimately with some or other form of capital allocation. We kind of alluded to this a minute or two ago in talking about like the value of work in the first place, right? Like work is pro-social because you're doing something that somebody else values, right? And that's why it's, in a very individual context, you should consider it good. At more of a macro level, though, you can't talk about the conditions of labor or employment or unemployment or whatever as if it exists in a vacuum. It exists entirely as a product of the conditions of allocating capital, and that maybe lends itself to suspecting part of the contribution of like the skew of power towards capital as opposed to labor. I guess I'm kind of open to that, but my point is more that this is just unavoidable. Like you shouldn't fail to understand this and just look at, and actually I can throw in one thing here that you might find kind of amusing. I have this massive pet peeve that I have no hope of anybody ever getting on board with this, by the way. It's more just like I'm in my ivory tower or my Twitter tower or whatever. I can be snarky about this. I hate unemployment as a metric because unemployment is not interesting. Unemployment is the default state. Employment is interesting. And okay, yes, it's just like one minus the other. Mathematically, it makes no difference. But I think in terms of it's massively behaviorally different in terms of thinking about what the number means, right? And I think it ties into the same point that if you think there are just, not you, but one thinks there are just kind of default conditions for labor, and labor is a block and it does this and it does that, you would tend towards like, okay, well, why doesn't everybody have a job? And, what is the unemployment rate? Whereas if you recognize that there needs to be capital productively deployed that is the product of which becomes even more valuable by the input of labor, you start to think instead, okay, well, why do people have jobs? And what are the conditions that lead to jobs even existing, and good jobs as well? And that's maybe leaning more in towards the political angle. So with all of that out of the way, I don't think you can really talk about the conditions of labor in a kind of a macro sense without recognizing what are the financial conditions that are either incentivizing or disincentivizing the entrepreneurship that is necessary to create these jobs. And so right back to where you started with the kind of macroeconomic trends, I would suggest there's a very heavy component. And again, I agree, it's probably helpful just to keep it in a US context, that from 1971 onwards, there was an increasing, what's the best way to even put this? Like a push to misprice capital such that entrepreneurship becomes more difficult in and of itself, but also more skewed towards finance. So almost every industry increasingly has some element of financialization, and that massively dictates what kind of jobs there are. And only downstream of all of this can you start to talk about, the conditions of labor. But by the time you're there, we're in the previous talking point, right? Which is, well, your housing is monetized, among many, many other things. So not to deny that, for example, China entering the WTO, like that's something that people commonly point to. Like labor law legalization and different trends around, gig economy and whatever. Like there's all these kind of talking points you can throw in. Not to deny that they are important, but I think they are significantly less important than, I guess, to be a bit rhetorical about it, like the financialization of everything, which has clearly happened in the US since 1971. I think that's by far and away the driving factor not driving, because obviously that's not directly connected to like China or, the technological factors that enable the gig economy. It's more that you can talk about the financialization on its own, but I don't think you can talk about anything else without mentioning financialization because of its impact. Because you can't avoid it. Like you can't decide not to interact with money. It's a whole system issue, right?
You can't. I don't think you can pull out any string and just say only that lever was pulled and that's entirely responsible. You can say it drove a lot of other factors as well.
Yeah, I think maybe a clean way of putting this is what I'm calling the financial mechanics are not sufficient as an explanation, but they are necessary. You can't talk about some other factor and not mention them because you quite literally won't understand it.
Sure. And just to go back to the point that I was making, like I don't present labor as a monolith, but whether you want to, do the analysis by median, quartile, quintile, whatever you want to do, clearly much worse off than the 80s, 70s. You want to look at affordability metrics. You want to look at as a percentage of,
well, I think because these things take time,
or
right?
anything.
All of these the process of financialization takes time. It's not a great, it's a pretty clumsy explanation, but I think it's directionally correct.
So you think that compounds over the decades?
I think you wouldn't, the state that we're in now, I don't think there's no alternative scenario in which we end up there by like 1973.
So financialization of assets, I entirely agree with you, that compounds, right? How do you explain income disparity then?
Because more and more, and it's helpful just to keep it US centric, more and more of the total income from which labor is going to be getting one share is skewed towards gains from asset appreciation rather than real productivity, because that's what the incentives are increasingly driven towards. And that's basically what I mean. That's like another interpretation of every industry becomes financialized. Everyone tries to become a rent seeker rather than actually contribute something productive. And if enough people do this, it becomes self-fulfilling, because when you're a rent seeker, you're seeking rent from someone else.
Yeah.
So this is like a very abstract framing of the same point that I think is helpful. We already went through this in kind of a more tangible sense of like workers go to their Fiat mining job to just about cover their rent, because housing is monetized. And again, I don't mean to disproportionately, well, no, I kind of do mean to disproportionately focus on housing just because it's something that absolutely everybody can relate to. But I think
it's the biggest line item expense in everyone's budget, right?
But I think that, what's even more insidious though is that this actually affects everything. It doesn't just affect housing. It's just like housing is the easiest, I think, to understand, but it affects everything. It's not
so
good.
Let's reverse engineer this thing then, right? Okay, look, we're going to say, financialization is the root of all the evils, right?
Yep.
Let's say that.
Again, that is my shtick, right?
So let's reverse engineer this and say no more money printing from now on.
Yep.
Right?
Tricky.
How do we? Let's just say we do it. Let's just say we do it. Okay, we wave a magic wand. I could even say, let's say we're on a Bitcoin standard. Maybe
that's better.
That would pique your interest a little bit more.
The difference is really worthwhile, right? So if the scenario is we're on a Bitcoin standard, then it's much easier to be like, great, everything's amazing. It's paradise from now on.
Okay. How do we unwind this?
You can't stop money print. This is why it's so bad. This is why we get from 1971 to now, and why it just only ever gets worse. If you stop money printing, everything implodes.
Okay.
So it will never stop.
Okay. Humor me.
Okay.
Allow me this indulgence and just say money printing stopped, and for the sake of this discussion, we can say magically we're instantly on a Bitcoin standard.
Okay, that's
so that
better.
you may believe the money printing has stopped. Okay. Explain to me how you would imagine the unwinding of what we've been through since 1971.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's much more complicated than. It's like it's easier to describe it in the negative, which is why it's helpful you're asking me about it unwinding. It's just everything bad that's happened like stops happening. It goes into reverse. Parker Lewis has a very good essay on this, which I believe is called The Great Definancialization. It might be Bitcoin and the Great Definancialization. I would encourage people to go read that, because what I will now say is just my poorly remembered retelling of the same argument. Basically, what happens is that no asset classes are monetized anymore, which means everything is priced for its actual utility and not its ersatz store of value component, given the money is broken and people need to save elsewhere.
Does that imply we have a housing market crash?
Good question. I mean, I think necessarily, but also you said we've already hyper Bitcoinized, so we're not. I'm not tracing fiat collapsing.
We're drawing a line, and we're just waking up suddenly. I know it won't happen that way.
I think yes, but even there, you kind of need to alter your perspective, because the idea of a housing market crash in a fiat context is terrifying, because people perceive so much of their wealth as being stored in their house. There shouldn't be such a thing. Prices going down should be good, right? This is a classic Bitcoin meme that the fiat economists don't understand.
Perhaps to be fair, we should have just taken a bit of a preamble to describe how we got to the point of no more money printing before the money. No, you want to just go? Let's go.
We're on a Bitcoin side.
I feel like we're being
honestly, like my answer. Maybe you can ask other people this for sure. Or if you have an answer, that'd be great. But my answer would be, I have no idea. Like I honestly just have no clue how this is going to work.
I think I do have an idea, because like by drawing a line as I did, perhaps might be a little bit more sensational, and we'll get some more views and clicks as well. But it's not really a realistic way of what would happen. So hyper Bitcoinization is going to happen over a long stretch of time. In that period of time, we're going to see demonetization in a gradual sense, perhaps not in such a rapid and sudden way where house prices fall, but we may see a plateauing of various financialized assets over a period of time. So perhaps setting the groundwork to then my question, which I should have prepared a bit earlier, like this.
Sure.
And so now after that period of preparation.
So with housing, right? Yeah. Like, yes, there will be, it depends how fast it happens, I guess. So maybe you don't end up describing it as a crash per se. But if you want to compare that to, I mean, basically any good, because housing is a good, right? You consume it. It happens to last for a very long time. So it has some resale value, but in a sane world, it wouldn't be an investment. If you compare to any other kind of good that you consume, all this terminology just sounds silly, right? So if you think about like I'm not even sure what, like television, say, or like phones or something like that. Or maybe if you want to be really kind of nerdy about it, some or other component of Moore's law, right? Like some metric of processing power or storage or something. Has there been a crash in the television market? Like, what does that even mean? It just means prices are going down because we're accumulating capital. It's a good thing, right? So this is kind of the most important, I think, again, almost behavioral thing to get out the way, that yes, maybe there's a crash from a fiat perspective, but not in the sense that there has been historically. So what would happen here would be very different to like 2008, for example. So 2008 is, in very broad strokes, is a credit bubble bursting where the credit had gone primarily into housing, right? What we're talking about here is housing's demonetization. It just loses its monetary premium. It becomes, some people will lose a lot of, not even money really, but perception of wealth, because they had been forced to perceive this as how they were storing their wealth. But I frankly don't have a lot of sympathy for that, because you shouldn't do that, right? I don't mean it's like immoral or anything. It's just the entire situation is immoral, even if the personal decisions aren't necessarily immoral. The obvious consequence, back to one of the previous points we were talking about, is that regular people can afford housing, which is just obviously a good thing. I don't see how you can possibly argue with that. Like, oh no, the poor landlords or whatever. Not that I want to go on again, it's verging into Marxist tirades against landlords. I have nothing against landlords, but I have a lot against a fiat-induced nightmare of nobody being able to afford to live. Like, I think this is just so obviously good that this unwinds. So that's thing number one, is that asset classes that have monetized, demonetize. And again, I think the easiest one to relate to is housing, but there's implications beyond that as well. Probably the next most important point, although it will be a lot subtler. I'm not sure it's something that most people will kind of obviously recognize in the way that they would recognize their rent coming down, say, is the implication of the proper pricing of capital. So this is what I was getting at in the previous answer, that the more skewed toward, like, financialization is self-fulfilling, and that the more rewards there are on offer for being closer to the money printer, the more capital will be allocated to businesses that are basically just skimming that flow rather than actually creating anything productive. So again, that also goes into reverse. There is no essentially political reward for starting a business, the point of which is to be close to the money spigot. The prices will levelize such that you are appropriately disincentivized to do that, because it's not actually creating any value, and appropriately incentivized to do literally whatever is creating value, which then in turn feeds through to labor being in a much healthier position, because their contribution will be priced fairly, I suppose, or accurately even in the first place. The extent to which you are able to provide value to your employer will be recognized on the basis of the value the employer is creating for society as a whole, not how close they are to the money spigot. And that will obviously be better too.
Okay, how does a barista get paid more under a Bitcoin standard than they do now?
So this is the tricky part. I'm not sure that a barista gets paid more. They might get paid marginally more on the basis that coffee chains will have a relatively lower cost of capital. So, or coffee chains that, I don't even know how a coffee chain would financialize itself. Although I'm sure it does happen. This is a tricky thing, right?
Real estate again. It's
probably real estate would be a component.
McDonald's model, right?
Yeah.
So
coffee chain. I mean, maybe ignore the exact details of how it's happening. If you just believe it's happening to some extent, coffee chains their employer will have a level playing field relative to all these financialized businesses, and they won't need to be financialized themselves to generate greater returns that are in line with the value they're actually providing to their customers in the first place. And hence the labor that they're employing will have more bargaining power just by definition, because there's more wealth being generated to be shared there. So that's one way. I'm scared. I don't want to oversell that though, because I don't think that's the most important way at all. I think the far more important part is that everything the barista buys will be cheaper. And will get cheaper forever, right? Meaning that they can actually save. So this is right back to the first thing we talked about before we got into all the financial mechanics. Basically, none of those circumstances will exist. They'll be, or they'll be materially different enough that they will afford the barista or whoever the worker is to have a much healthier attitude about work, right? They'll be working in order to save, and they'll be able to afford things that they need to purchase, have capital left over, think long term, be more pro-social, and then ideally, eventually, actually own capital themselves. That's a really interesting angle. I kind of wish we'd mentioned this before, but this is a good avenue to kind of sneak it in. That to me, the saddest thing about that kind of dichotomy of like, who has the power? Is it labor or is it capital? I think the key reason that I mentioned this a couple of times too, is that this person doesn't actually exist, but I'm imagining there's like a Marxist here, right, who I'm arguing against. The key thing that I would disagree with them about is kind of like objecting to the question almost, in the sense of insisting that these are discrete groups of people rather than roles. I think in a healthy society, and to be clear, there's like, I'm sympathetic to, there's not just a single thread, right? There's like political components to this, there's social components, but there is my whole shtick is that there's necessarily, unavoidably a financial component to this. And when you kind of fix the money, fix the world, right? We have to say that too. When you fix the money, you're in a much healthier position for people to choose which of these they want to be. So they can choose to become capitalists because they have saved enough capital. They have, sound money actually enables this function, but they don't have to if they don't want to. Maybe they just end up spending it all. It's they have significantly more freedom. And actually, even this is maybe less widely popularized, but it touches on what we've mentioned. They can choose to become labor for basically the same reason, right? Like for some time, probably you do have to work, but you can get to a point where you don't have to, if that is what you want. So it's ultimately just that people have more freedom, frankly. They have more optionality as a function, by and large, of being able to think long term. I think that it's really all downstream of that. That if you're forced to think extremely short term, you just don't have these options. And that's unfortunately the position I think a lot of people find themselves in today.